The wind blew over the plains, like an old voice trying to tell its last story. It carried the smell of rain that never came, brushing over the tall grass and bending it like a sea of whispers. Calder Boone sat high on his black horse, his frame too large for the worn saddle. People called him a giant, and not just for his height or the breadth of his shoulders, but for the silence he carried like a second skin. In town, men would glance at him, then lower their voices, as if his quiet nature was heavier than words could bear. That evening, he rode home with dust on his boots and sweat drying on his brow, the day's labor etched into every tendon of his hands. The sun bled itself thin across the horizon, painting the land in gold and fire. It was the hour when the West felt most honest, neither cruel nor forgiving, just endless. He turned his horse toward Boone Ranch, an empty stretch of land where his mother's ghost still lingered in memory. He could almost hear her voice in the wind, telling him, as she used to, build something worth keeping, Calder. He had built fences and barns and broken himself in the process, but none of it had chased away the silence. It was then he spotted her at first. She looked like a mirage, a small figure crumpled near the edge of a dry creek bed, her body blending with the earth. He slowed his horse, his hand tightening on the reins, eyes narrowing against the fading light. She was still alive. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, though her lips were split and parched, and her hair, dark and matted, clung to her face like damp roots. She didn't look at him, she glared, even in her weakness. Like a wounded wolf, unwilling to die under the gaze of a stranger, Calder dismounted, every movement deliberate so as not to startle her. He crouched beside her, his shadow falling across her small frame. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. Her eyes burned into him, defiant even as her breath came in shallow pools. There was blood dried along her temple, and the torn edge of her dress told of a struggle, of something violent that had left her alone out here. When he reached for her arm, she flinched so hard it startled him. Her hand shot up with the last of her strength, as if to push him away, but her fingers trembled and fell useless against his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, but she gave no answer, only shut her eyes, as though trusting the ground more than the man beside her. There were vultures circling overhead, black silhouettes against the dying sun. He didn't have time to ask her permission. With a gentleness that contradicted his size, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her onto his horse, feeling the warmth of her fevered skin seep through his shirt. She weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of twigs, fragile enough to snap in the wrong wind. The ride back to Boone Ranch was quiet except for the horse's steady breathing. Calder glanced down at her now and then, seeing how stubbornly she clung to consciousness, her eyes flickering open only to narrow at him, mistrust raw and sharp. There was pride in that gaze, a kind of unyielding spirit he hadn't seen in years, not since his mother's passing, when she'd looked at death with the same quiet defiance. When they reached the ranch, the sky had bruised into twilight. He carried her inside, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. The house was plain and hollow, filled only with the scent of cedar and the memory of better days. He laid her on his mother's old bed, the quilt faded but clean. She stirred, murmuring something in a language he didn't know, her voice cracked and soft as river stones. He fetched water, coaxing her to sip. She turned her head away at first, her jaw tight. "You'll die if you don't," he told her. There was no harshness in his tone, only an unspoken truth, and eventually she allowed the tin cup to touch her lips. She drank in small, stubborn gulps, as if even accepting water from him was a kind of defeat. When she fell asleep, Calder sat at the table, staring at his rough hands. He wasn't sure why he'd brought her here. Maybe it was because the sight of her broken, yet unbowed, had stirred something in him he didn't have a name for. Or maybe it was just that the West had already claimed too many lives, and he couldn't stand to see another soul swallowed by it. The next morning, she was awake before the sun had fully risen. Calder found her standing near the door, one hand on the frame as if ready to run. Her eyes were sharper now, and he could see the color of them deep, like the river after rain. She didn't thank him. She just stood there, silent and wary, like a deer that might bolt at the first wrong move. "I'm Calder Boone," he said, as though his name might soften the distance between them. She didn't respond, but after a moment, she pointed to herself and said, "Ahyoka." Her voice was low, the syllables soft yet firm. He repeated her name under his breath, tasting it like something sacred. Ahyoka. She refused breakfast, though. He saw her glance at the plate of cornbread he'd left on the table. "You're safe here," he tried, but she didn't meet his eyes. Later, when he rode into town for supplies, whispers followed him like gnats. Mrs. Renshaw, with her pinched face and sharp tongue, leaned across the counter at the general store. "I hear you got company out there on the Boone spread," she said. "Folks are token, Calder. A man alone with an Indian girl. It don't look right." Calder said nothing. He collected his goods and left, but her words clung to him like dust he couldn't shake off. By the time he returned, his mood was a heavy shadow. He saw Ahyoka outside, kneeling in the yard with something cradled in her hands. It was a sparrow with a broken wing. She was whispering to it, her fingers delicate as she stroked its feathers. When she noticed him watching, she didn't look away. There was something in her gaze, defiance, yes, but also a quiet strength. That made him feel smaller than his size. That evening, he found her in the kitchen, holding the shawl that had once belonged to his mother. He'd left it folded on the bed, unsure if it would mean anything to her. She touched it as if it were a memory she didn't own but could still feel. For the first time, she looked at him without suspicion. "Cold," she said simply, her English halting. He nodded. "You can keep it," he replied. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to say something, but she only lowered her gaze and pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Over the next days, something began to shift between them. He showed her how to draw water from the well, guiding her hands when she struggled with the heavy rope. She said little, but one morning, as the sun rose like a pale coin in the sky, she pointed upward and said a word he didn't know. "Sky," she added in English. He repeated the word in her language, clumsy on his tongue, and she gave the faintest nod, almost a smile. Still, tension lingered, like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. Calder felt it every time he went into town, heard it in the way folks lowered their voices when he walked by. They didn't see kindness in what he was doing. They saw scandal, weakness, something unmanly. He carried their judgment like stones in his pockets, but when he looked at Ahyoka sitting by the fire at night, her face bathed in the glow, he felt those stones crumble. Just a little. On the fifth evening, the wind rose sharp and cold. Calder stepped out to check the horses, and when he returned, Ahyoka was at the door, staring out into the dark. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head, but there was fear in her eyes. He followed her gaze and saw nothing but the endless sweep of night. Yet something in her stillness made his own skin prickle. Inside, The fire crackled. They sat across from each other, the silence stretched between them like a rope that might break if pulled too tight. Calder wanted to ask her where she'd come from, what had driven her into the wasteland alone, but he didn't. Instead, he watched the way the firelight painted her face, how the flicker of it softened her hardness, if only for a moment. Finally, Ahyoka broke the silence. "They come," she said quietly, almost like a warning. He frowned. "Who?" Her gaze met his, steady and unblinking. "My people." The words settled into him like stones thrown into a deep well. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but he felt the shift in the air. Something was coming, something that would test not just his strength, but whatever fragile thread of trust had begun to weave between them. Outside, the wind howled through the plains. Inside, Calder and Ahyoka sat with the fire between them, the night pressing close, and neither of them looked away. The first sign of them came with the rumble of distant hooves. Calder heard it before dawn, a low, rolling sound like thunder crawling over the plains. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at his skin, and saw them cresting the far ridge riders, dark against the silver light of morning, their silhouettes tall and unyielding. They moved like shadows given life, each carrying the weight of a world he did not understand. Ahyoka stood in the doorway behind him, her hand gripping the frame, her eyes fixed on the approaching line. She did not flinch. "They're here," she said softly. There was no fear in her tone, but something quieter acceptance, as if this moment had been waiting for her all along. Calder turned, searching her face, but she offered nothing more. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a mixture of protectiveness and unease. He didn't know what these riders wanted. He only knew he couldn't let them take her if she didn't wish to go. When the riders stopped at the edge of his yard, there were 10 of them, each sitting tall and still on their horses. Their leader was an older man, his hair streaked with grey, his face carved deep with years and stories. He carried himself like someone who had seen too much to ever. "Bo," Ahyoka stepped forward, and the man's expression softened by a fraction. "Silas Crow," she whispered, her voice almost reverent. The elder dismounted with slow grace, his boots sinking into the cold earth. His eyes swept over Calder, measuring him with a gaze that felt as heavy as stone. Then he looked to Ahyoka. They exchanged words in their language, fast and sharp, like arrows loosed between them. Calder couldn't follow, but he could read the tension in their voices, the weight of family, tradition, and unspoken grief. Finally, Silas Crow turned to him. His English was careful, but strong. "You took her in," he said. "It wasn't a question." Calder nodded. "She would have died out there." The elder's gaze sharpened, as though trying to decide if this man, this giant rancher, could possibly understand what it meant to save a life like hers. "A man who saves a woman takes on her shadow," Silas said. "He does not leave her standing alone." Calder frowned, uncertain of the meaning. Ahyoka stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "He says, you must stand for me, or they will. Take me back." "Take you back," Calder repeated. "Do you want to go?" Her eyes met his then, steady and unflinching. "No," she said simply, and the single word cut through him like an arrow. Silas studied them both, then spoke again, his tone final. "If she stays, you marry her. There is no other way." The air between them went still. Calder felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his boots. Marriage. He had lived alone for so long that the very idea felt like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Yet, when he looked at Ahyoka, The quiet strength in her posture, the fire in her eyes, he realized there was no fear there, only something that almost resembled trust. Calder began, but his voice caught. He wasn't sure if he was worthy of something as binding as a vow. This isn't. Ahyoka placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light, but it silenced him more effectively than any words. I will stand with you, she said, and in her voice he heard no hesitation, only a quiet resolve that made his own heart steady. The tribe remained outside, their presence like a wall of judgment and watchfulness. Calder spent the evening wrestling with his thoughts, the sound of the wind rattling through the shutters as if urging him to decide. He sat on the porch long after dark, his hands clasped, staring at the stars. They burned like campfires in the distance, like stories whispered by the dead. His mother's voice rose in his mind. Build something worth keeping, Calder. Ahyoka joined him without a word, sitting on the step beside him, the shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. For a long time, they simply listened to the night. Then she spoke, her voice softer than the wind. In my people's stories, the stars are the fires of those who came before. They watch to see if we live with honor. He turned to her, her profile painted in moonlight. And what do they see when they look at me? She didn't answer right away. Then, with the faintest smile, she said, they see a man who does not turn away from what is hard. Something in his chest eased. At that, he reached out, hesitated, then let his rough hand rest over hers. She did not pull away by dawn. The decision had been made. The morning was pale and cold, the sun barely touching the horizon when the tribe gathered before the house. Calder stood in his cleanest shirt, his hair combed but still unruly. He felt awkward, like a bear forced to dance. Ahyoka stood beside him, her hair braided neatly, her face calm. Silas Crow stepped forward, speaking in both English and Comanche, his words weaving a ceremony that felt older than the land itself. Calder said little, only nodding when prompted, but his eyes never left Ahyoka's. He saw the strength in her stance, the quiet fire that had kept her alive out there in the wilderness. When the final words were spoken, she looked at him not with fear or uncertainty, but with something steadier, deeper. It was not love yet, not the kind people sang about, but it was the seed of it, and that was enough. The tribe remained for a short while, offering gifts of food and woven cloth. There were no smiles, but there was no hostility, either only recognition that something had been bound here, something that would not easily break. Silas Crow clasped Calder's forearm before leaving, his eyes sharp but not unkind. Take care of her, he said simply. When the riders disappeared over the horizon, the ranch felt different. The silence was no longer empty. That evening, Calder and Ahyoka sat by the fire. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and bread baking in the oven. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Her presence filled the hollow spaces of the house, and his quiet strength wrapped around her like a second shelter. Later, when the night deepened and the stars burned bright overhead, Calder stepped outside. He leaned against the railing of the porch, staring at the dark horizon. He thought of how quickly life had changed, how a week ago he'd ridden home alone, with nothing but dust and silence for company. Now there was a fire inside, and a woman who had chosen to stand beside him even when the world pressed against them. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Ahyoka had followed, the shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. She stepped closer, her gaze lifting to the sky. The stars, she said quietly, they see us now. Calder looked up too, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. "What do you think they'll say?" She smiled faintly. "That we are learning how to stay." For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, the wind stirring. Her braid, the night carrying their quiet breathing. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it didn't need to be. In this vast, unforgiving land, sometimes the smallest promises were the ones that held. Calder reached for her hand, and this time, she took it without hesitation. Her fingers were warm, steady. He felt something shift, not just between them, but within himself. The silence he had carried for so long no longer felt like a burden. It felt like space, wide enough to hold both of them. Inside, the fire crackled, waiting. Outside, the stars burned with a patient, eternal light. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew that this was only the beginning.